Okay. This is for both YouTube and Facebook. I'm doing this video as a introduction to trying to get my group up off the ground and to connect with other like-minded late 70s, early 80s babies. Babies that were born in the late 70s and early 80s. Late 70s, early 80s. Those that were born between the 1977 to 1985 time span of birth years. This is basically trying to connect with other like-minded individuals and or people to connect with fellow XENNIALs, those that were born between the 1977 and 1985 time slot, where we are basically sandwiched in between that of Generation X and that of the main body of the Millennial Generation, so to speak. This is basically a talking about how we share common traits, common ideals, and even some practices that are shared with both Generation X and that of the Millennial Generation. The era of which we were born shares the exact same ideals of both generations. Basically, those who were born in the early 80s and late 70s has the same type of shared kind of traits and practices and habits that you would find in both Generation X and that of the Millennial Generation. But we're not fully entrenched solely into Generation X, nor are we solely entrenched and have our entire feet in that of the Millennial Generation. We don't share similar or full ideological ideology with either generation. We kind of have like a mixture of both in some regards to that of Generation X and that of the Millennial Generation. I have, I felt out of place for a while. I didn't know. I kind of felt like I was part of a wrong generation group of people. Come to find out, my feelings and other people's feelings have been pretty much right all along regarding kind of like the wrong era we think that we have grown up in. Instead of like growing up in kind of like the older generational era, basically, of course, Generation X. But we still have the firm beliefs and kind of like the thankfulness that we are part of the whole Millennial Generation at the same time. How we kind of have the best of both worlds. We have the best of both of Generation X and the Millennial Generation. We kind of share same or similar beliefs and traits and habits of both generations, to say the least. And there's this whole new thing coming about by various YouTubers, bloggers, vloggers, and even other people on Facebook that are coming about who call themselves XENNIALs. XENNIALs is like a combination of Generation X and Millennials. It's basically trying to create for ourselves our own independent identity. Basically saying that we're not fully entrenched into Generation X, nor are we fully entrenched into the Millennial Generation. We call ourselves the Cusp Generation, or a transitional generation that transitions from one generation to the next generation. Um, when it comes to an era, a decade, a generation, or a certain specific time, it doesn't go from one thing to the next into one big cutoff. It goes through a time where it starts to slowly change over a period of time. And that's what is known as a transitional period of time, or transitional time period, where things begin to change and from one era to the next. And it's people like myself who believe that we were born in that certain time slot where we were born in the era of some major sweeping changes that was occurring in the world and in the United States, and regarding technology, computers, personal computing, um, and then anything to do with with technology in general, or even entertainment on what's on TV and what's on on the television or TV networks, or what we see in clothing and fashion, to I guess you would think politics. We don't we don't those of us who were basically babies from the late 1970s to the early 1980s, we see ourselves a little bit differently than those who were born in the early 1970s and of the late 1980s. Those that were born in the early 1970s and those that were born in the late 1980s, late 70s, no, not late 70s, early 70s and late 80s. Even to the generation that was born in the late 1960s and even the early 1990s. We don't feel it that we are part of those generations. Those that were born in the late 1960s, all the into the early 1990s, and the early 1970s to the late 1980s. Our period, our decade, is firmly entrenched in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The late 70s to the early 80s, which we believe are our own specific group of generational people that were born in that particular time slot, in that time period of the late 70s, early 80s. We see ourselves far different from those who were born in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and that of the late 1980s and the early 1990s. We see ourselves far different from any and all of those groups of people. We don't share, I guess, some of their ideals or some of their ideologies or some of their beliefs, somewhat. We're more between the millennial and that of Generation X, the most, than the generations that either that are basically outside of that fray. So this is a call out to people on YouTube and Facebook. I would love to basically come and contact you, and to see if we could help build our unique community of like-minded individuals who were born in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Basically, those that were not born in the early 1970s or the late 1980s or even the late 1960s or even the early 1990s. Basically, just looking for a certain type of specific people who share a common late 70s, early 80s type of, I guess, vibe, uniqueness, kind of like a certain vibe of group or a group of individuals who share a common trait and belief and all of that. That's what I'm trying to get in touch with, and to basically be involved with other like-minded individuals like myself and others out there who have the just to get in touch with each other and to build our community, to build our uniqueness, so to speak, and to build for ourselves a unique group of people who would love to stand out amongst the crowd of other people who have stood out, but to have, for our group to be able to stand out as well and to be able to express ourselves in a way that's also unique to our specific group of people, to our age range, those of us who were born between 1977 to 1983 or 1985. Basically try to contact other individuals like ourselves, those of us who are late 70s and early 80s babies, those that were born between the late 1970s and late 1970s and early 1980s. Those that were not born in the early 1970s and late 1980s, basically. So, I guess is what I'm saying. We are a different type of people, and those who are not in our classification of people, just to know that we, those who are just straight Generation Xers, were born a little bit earlier than that. Those who are strictly millennials were born strictly a little bit later than that. Are, I guess, are on either side of us. All these generations, even the baby boomer generation, came before Generation X came along. All their generations are definitely acknowledged, and so is the millennial generation, and including Generation Z. But the only ones who have actually been not acknowledged are the XENNIALs. XENNIALs is basically Generation X Millennials, who are between Generation X and that of the Millennial Generation. So we kind of see ourselves a little bit different from all those other groups, from the baby boomers to Generation X to the Millennials and to Generation Z. We're kind of in between all of those groups in the center. We see ourselves as the center of those groups, basically going from the late 1970s and early 1980s. That's what we kind of see ourselves as. So yeah, that's what I've been wanting to say. So this is my first high quality HD video on the subject regarding my take on this. Yeah, I want to be able to grow our community of people, of like-minded people and share the same traits and habits and kind of ideals with other like-minded exennial minded people out there of late 70s, early 80s babies that were born in the late 70s, early 80s time span. So I would it would be very exciting to see those who had a analog childhood and now a digital adulthood who remember growing up in a analog world without the internet, without the computers, without all the modern technology that we have today, but yet still have a modern digital adulthood today, and still can have that experience with both analog and digital technology, and still be able to integrate between both forms of technology and still have that same experience between either both. I would love to come in contact with some very interesting folk out there that would share some interesting tidbits on their own life and to connect with others of like-minded individuals like myself and others who share the same exact kind of uniqueness to what I kind of go by in and all of that. I would love to connect with other people who have got interesting life stories and interesting childhoods and very interesting and maybe even some complicated stories even in their adulthood years, and how living in a sort of digitized world today is how that contrasts to the digital free analog childhood, living in a analog based world, growing up as kids growing up in their childhood years, and having that certain vibe or feel when it comes to hearing and connecting with certain experiences on the subject. I would love to connect with others and build that community of like-minded individuals and share that uniqueness, including what we used to wear growing up, what type of fads were around when we were born, what type of styles of even cars, to that of what was very popular back then, which was the traditional brick and mortar shopping malls and shopping centers, to the music of the day and the music of the generation of kids of us who were growing up, and what was popular on the radio, to and the likes, of course, to the technology that we experienced both when we were kids to that of our adulthood years living today. And to have that community, to build that community up, then we can share that with other people who don't share the same, generation as we are, and basically take our stories and share our experiences with other people all over, and to have that special ability to share that that kind of analog to digital experience with others, and to have that unique mindset to basically create this wonderful, unique, fun experience that those of us who think is an amazing thing to share. So that's what I wanted to talk about on the subject, is connecting with other exennials, late 70s, early 80s babies, so to speak. I don't. We don't consider those of us who are like the late Generation Xers, those that were born in the late 70s, don't even fully see themselves as Generation X either. And those that were born in the early 80s, those who see themselves as the earliest millennials, don't see themselves as fully millennials either. So we're kind of in our own group between the late 70s and early 80s. Uh, we're kind of different because we I guess we kind of have the same likes, dislikes, and traits from both generations, and kind of mashed together into our I guess generation. Um, we kind of like the same things. We kind of like uh, I guess kind of the same music, or somewhat like dislike the same music. Music from like that kind of have a certain time span where I guess it depends on age. It really depends on age and what how many years ago we were born. I guess it depends on basically age, basically, and the era of which we were born, and the type of decade, and when in that type of decade we were actually born in. How that determines, I guess, who we are and who our particular group are, and all of that. So yeah, I would like to connect with others of like mind, like myself, and get in touch with other people and other individuals like myself out there. So that's all I wanted to say on the subject. So catch you all later, and bye bye for now. And to meet my other fellow XENNIALs. Catch you later.